Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In Atlanta, Jackson Miller was a police officer known for his excessive authority and volatile temper. From the start, he believed his uniform was a passport to impunity. Black citizens, young people, or anyone who dared to contradict him were often victims of his arrogance and underlying racism. His superiors had reprimanded him several times, but his ego and sense of superiority made him impervious to any criticism. That morning, Jackson was patrolling the busy city streets. The sun beat down on the buildings, and the traffic was heavy. Suddenly, he spotted a black sedan parked in front of a small gas station. Inside, a smartly dressed man in a crisp military uniform appeared to be calmly checking his papers. Jackson frowned. The man had an imposing stature and a calm expression, but that calmness was merely a provocation to Jackson, who saw every challenge as a personal affront. Without thinking, he stopped his vehicle, got out abruptly, and approached the car. Each step echoed on the asphalt, conveying his perceived authority. When he stood in front of the driver, his arm trembled slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline and suppressed anger. "Your papers and your license," he ordered in a sharp voice. The man slowly raised his eyes towards him. His features were calm, but imbued with a natural authority. "Officer," he replied calmly, "may I know the reason for this check?" The man's calm demeanor filled Jackson with a mixture of exasperation and contempt. He couldn't fathom how someone could remain so composed in the face of his intimidation. At that moment, Jackson decided to cross the line he never crossed. In a dramatic and dangerous move, he drew his weapon and pointed it directly at the driver. Jackson's blood boiled with a feeling of immediate power. He believed that this threat alone would be enough to terrify the man. But the driver, far from giving in to fear, slowly took his hands out of the car and addressed him in a firm voice. "Officer, I advise you to think about what you are doing." The man's calm and determination made Jackson waver, but not enough to make him lower his weapon. What he didn't know was that the man he was threatening wasn't just any civilian. He was the Colonel Marcus Thompson, a decorated U.S. Army veteran, respected for his discipline, courage, and integrity. A few passers-by, alerted by the tension of the scene, took out their phones and began filming. Each click, each flash, each whisper reinforced the gravity of the situation. Jackson, focused on his own authority, didn't yet realize that his career had just been turned upside down in a matter of seconds. Jackson Miller's arrogance had just met its match, a man whose rank and composure commanded respect, a man who had never been intimidated in his life. This confrontation would mark the beginning of the policeman's immediate downfall, and nothing could stop him now. That morning, the Atlanta heat was already palpable. The sun beat down on car windows and made the asphalt gleam like a burning mirror. Jackson Miller patrolled in his police car, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on every passing vehicle. For the past few weeks, he'd been frustrated. Complaints of racism were starting to circulate against some of his colleagues, and he felt an invisible pressure weighing on him. But for Jackson, his uniform still represented law and order, and he intended to demonstrate it. That's when he spotted a brand new black sedan parked in front of a gas station. The driver, a black man in his 50s, had the impeccable bearing of a military man. Upright posture, a perfectly pressed white shirt, epaulets on his uniform. Jackson felt a surge of irritation. He didn't like that kind of quiet confidence. "Who does he think he is, challenging my authority?" he thought. Without thinking, Jackson stopped his vehicle, got out quickly, and slammed the door behind him. He walked towards the car, each step echoing with a mixture of anger and condescension. "Hello," he said in a dry voice, "your papers and your license, immediately." The man behind the wheel looked up. His features were calm, but his gaze conveyed a natural, almost military authority. "Officer," he replied calmly, "may I ask why you are checking me?" Jackson frowned. The man's measured tone and calm demeanor were an affront to his own authority. How dare he speak to me like that, he thought. The crowd that was beginning to gather at the gas station was not immune to this silent conflict. Customers and passers-by watched curiously, some already pulling out their phones. Losing patience, Jackson tried to provoke the man. "A car like this can't be driven without proper documentation," he said, pointing at the black sedan. "Are you sure you're not hiding anything from me?" The man didn't flinch. He remained motionless, his hands on the steering wheel, his face impassive. It was like staring at a wall of calm and discipline, and for Jackson, it was unbearable. Suddenly, in a rash and dangerous move, Jackson drew his weapon and pointed it directly at the driver. "Get out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice trembling with adrenaline and suppressed anger. Far from being intimidated, the driver slowly placed his hands on the dashboard and stepped out of the car. His voice was firm and confident. "Officer, I advise you to reflect on your actions." Jackson felt his blood boil. No one had ever spoken to him like that. But what he didn't know was that the man he was threatening wasn't an ordinary citizen. He was Colonel Marcus Thompson, a decorated U.S. Army veteran, respected for his discipline and courage. Passers-by continued filming, their phones capturing every movement. Jackson was still focused on his display of power, but he sensed a growing tension, a murmur in the air like an invisible warning. This simple check was about to turn into a brutal lesson in arrogance and racism. The Atlanta sun was already heating the street, its light reflecting off the stationary black sedan. Witnesses had begun to gather around the gas station, intrigued and worried by the intensity of the scene. Jackson Miller, his face tense, felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins. For him, every glance at the situation was a personal challenge. He had to show that he was the master here, that no civilian could defy him. "You know," Jackson said through gritted teeth, "you can't drive a car like this without valid documents." "And you, sir, are you sure everything is in order?" Colonel Marcus Thompson, straight as a ramrod, with a calm expression, replied. "Everything is in order, officer. And I've already shown you my license and the car registration." Jackson felt a dull irritation rising within him. This apparent calm was an insult. He took a step closer, his weapon still aimed, and tried to unsettle him. "Are you sure you're not lying to me? You know I can check that, and I'm not joking." Passers-by murmured amongst themselves, some shocked by the officer's behavior. A young woman took out her phone and began filming. Jackson, focused on his display of power, didn't immediately notice. Marcus took a deep breath. His calmness contrasted with Jackson's anger, but every word he spoke was charged with authority. "Officer Miller," he said slowly, "I am a veteran of the American Army. I advise you to put away your weapon and consider your attitude." Marcus's name and tone made Jackson waver, but his pride prevented him from backing down. The provocation escalated in his mind. "Veteran or not," Jackson replied, "I enforce the law here." "And you think your uniform protects you? I'll show you." He made a sudden movement, tightening his grip on the weapon. Passers-by stepped back slightly, some murmuring, "He's crazy," others, "It's dangerous." At that precise moment, a sergeant came running from the patrol car parked a few meters away. David Harris, Jackson's direct superior, shouted. "Miller! Put your weapon away immediately." Jackson hesitated, his face flushed with anger and adrenaline. He felt the situation slipping out of his control, but his ego refused to give way. Marcus, motionless, stared straight into his eyes. "Officer," Marcus repeated, calmly but firmly, "you are making a grave mistake." Jackson lowered his weapon slightly, but it was too late. The tension in the air was palpable, and every witness had already captured the moment on their phone. The scene, which could have been a simple traffic stop, was turning into a public scandal before Jackson even realized the magnitude of his mistake. The Atlanta sun still bathed the gas station in a bright light, but the atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. The stunned witnesses cautiously backed away, some with their phones pointed at the scene. Jackson Miller, his face red with anger and adrenaline, held his gun firmly, trained on Colonel Marcus Thompson. "Get out of the vehicle," Jackson ordered, his voice trembling despite himself. "I don't want to repeat myself." Marcus took a deep breath, his unwavering calm a stark contrast to Jackson's fury. He slowly placed his hands on the dashboard, then stepped out of the car. "Officer Miller," he said in a firm but calm voice, "I advise you to reflect on your actions." Every word the colonel said seemed to weigh a ton. Jackson felt a shiver run down his spine, but he refused to lower his weapon. His ego, his arrogance, and his racism screamed at him to keep up the pressure. "I'm upholding the law," Jackson replied, his voice hard and a little hoarse. "You won't escape me." At that moment, murmurs arose among the witnesses. Some whispered, "He's a colonel." Others said, "That officer is crazy." Marcus, unperturbed, made a slow gesture towards his wallet and took out a metal card. Passers-by could read the text, "Colonel Marcus Thompson, United States Army." Jackson, for the first time all day, felt his blood run cold. He had just pointed his gun at a senior Army officer, a respected veteran. His hand trembled slightly, but his pride still prevented him from admitting his mistake. You're a colonel?" Jackson stammered, his voice betraying a glimmer of panic. Marcus did not answer immediately. He remained upright, his gaze fixed, imposing an almost military silence. Then, calmly, "Yes. And you are committing an act that will ruin your career and your reputation. I advise you to put that weapon away now." At that moment, another police car sped up. The Sergeant David Harris. He quickly went downstairs, alerted by the incident. He immediately saw Jackson, his gun still pointed, and shouted, "Miller! Put away your gun. This is unacceptable." Passers-by held their breath. The tension was palpable, almost electric. Jackson, overwhelmed by adrenaline and fear, felt his world crumble around him. He finally lowered his weapon, but the scene was already etched in the minds of all the witnesses and filmed on numerous phones. Marcus Thompson, still calm, took a step forward and simply stated, "The law is there to protect, not to intimidate. You have just crossed a line that you can never erase." Silence fell. Jackson realized, too late, that his career and reputation were now at stake. His arrogance and racism had just led to his imminent downfall. The tension at the gas station was almost palpable. The witnesses, frozen like statues, kept their eyes fixed on Jackson Miller and Colonel Marcus Thompson. The air seemed to vibrate with an electric energy, heavy with suspense. Even the hot Atlanta summer breeze seemed to hold its breath. Marcus Thompson, ever calm, made a slow, methodical movement. He took out his black leather wallet and opened it with military precision. In complete silence, he showed his card. "Colonel Marcus Thompson, United States Army, rank and official distinctions." The murmurs of the crowd turned into shocked exclamations. "He's a colonel," whispered a woman, her face pale. "Oh my God, he pointed his gun at a colonel!" exclaimed a young man. Jackson Miller felt his heart pounding wildly. Each beat resonated in his head like a judgment drum. He had just realized the magnitude of his mistake. Pointing his gun at a high-ranking Army officer, a decorated veteran, was more than a mistake, it was a professional and moral crime. You're a colonel?" Jackson stammered, his voice trembling, searching for an escape route in the void. Marcus, motionless, stared at Jackson with icy calm. His voice, though low and deliberate, cut through the air like a scalpel. "Yes, officer. And I advise you to put away your weapon immediately. Every moment you maintain this threat against me only worsens your situation." At that moment, the Sergeant David Harris, Jackson's direct superior, rushed out of the patrol car. He looked at Jackson and yelled, "Miller! Put away your gun immediately. Do you know what you're doing?" Jackson, finally confronted with the truth, dropped his weapon. Passers-by applauded timidly, some sighed with relief. The scene was now irreversible, everyone had seen, filmed, and understood Jackson's arrogance and Marcus's dignity. Marcus took a step forward, his hands still raised in a gesture of neutrality. "The law exists to protect, not to intimidate. You have just crossed a line that can never be erased." Jackson felt shame wash over him, his face turning from the red of anger to the pale of humiliation. He had thought he wielded absolute power, but he had just encountered a brick wall, the discipline, respect, and authority of a man who had never been intimidated. Behind him, the crowd was stirring. Videos were already circulating on social media. Some witnesses were whispering, "He's going to lose his job, that's for sure. We should call the press." Jackson Miller, frozen to the spot, finally understood that what had begun as a simple traffic stop was about to become a public scandal. The revelation of Marcus Thompson's rank left no doubt. His career was over before his superiors could even make a decision. The scene at the gas station had gone viral before Jackson Miller even realized what was happening. Stunned passers-by had pulled out their phones and were filming every move. Indignant murmurs turned into loud comments, echoing through the street like a collective judgment. "He pointed his gun at a colonel," exclaimed a young woman, her hands trembling. "You see? That's racism," shouted a student, pointing at Jackson. Jackson felt the pressure mounting. Every glance fixed on him was a silent accusation, and every phone pointed at him seemed to record his impending downfall. His face turned red, his jaw tightened. He was trapped, not only by Marcus Thompson, but by the entire crowd, who were eager to witness his defeat. "Officer," Marcus Thompson repeated calmly, "you will regret this decision if you do not put away your weapon." But Jackson, stubborn as ever, still refused to give in. He wanted to assert his authority, to show that he was in control of the situation. However, every word he uttered was now being filmed and recorded. The murmurs of passers-by were turning into public accusations. "He's going to get fired. It's unbelievable," a police officer points his weapon at a respected civilian. At that moment, a passerby approached and began live-streaming the video on social media. Notifications exploded almost instantly. Hundreds of people were watching the scene in real time, commenting on Jackson's arrogance and Marcus's dignity. "You're ruining your career," someone shouted from the crowd. "Put that weapon away," insisted another voice. Jackson felt panic rising within him. He had always believed his uniform gave him absolute power, but now the law, morality, and the gaze of the crowd were all against him. Every passing second, every camera pointed at him, sealed his fate a little more. The Sergeant David Harris, out of breath after his run, he stood next to Jackson and firmly ordered, "Miller, put away your weapon. You're crossing a line you can never erase." Jackson finally obeyed, his hands trembling. A feeling of shame and loss of authority overwhelmed him. Marcus Thompson, still calm, took a step forward and addressed the crowd. "The law and discipline must be respected. Violence and arrogance have no place in our society." The crowd applauded timidly, some breaking into murmurs of satisfaction. For the first time, Jackson felt the crushing weight of his actions. He was no longer in control. His impulsive gestures and racism had just sparked a scandal that would resonate far beyond this gas station. The videos were already circulating on social media, destined to go viral, and Jackson Miller's reputation was beginning to crack under the watchful eyes of thousands of viewers. His world, built on authority and arrogance, was crumbling. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, and the hot Atlanta air seemed to weigh heavily on everyone. Jackson Miller still stood motionless, his hands trembling after lowering his weapon, while Colonel Marcus Thompson remained upright, imposing and calm. Witnesses filmed every gesture, every breath, and the weight of the situation seemed to crush the arrogant officer. Suddenly, a police car sped up, sirens blaring. The Sergeant David Harris, Jackson's superior officer, jumped out of the vehicle. His face was red with anger, and his authority immediately overshadowed Jackson's. "Miller," Harris shouted, approaching, "put away your gun. Do you know what you just did?" Jackson, seized by panic, instinctively stepped back. He knew the situation had just spiraled out of control. Harris fixed Marcus Thompson with immediate respect and gave a military salute. "Colonel Thompson, it's an honor, sir." The crowd around them fell silent instantly, impressed by the contrast between the colonel's discipline and respect and Jackson's obvious panic. Harris then turned to Jackson, his voice firm and sharp. "Jackson Miller, your behavior is unacceptable. You threatened a senior officer, endangered the life of a respected civilian, and you just made a fool of yourself in front of this whole crowd. Put away your weapon and follow me." Jackson, stunned, obeyed without resistance. His pride, anger, and arrogance were replaced by a mixture of shame, fear, and disbelief. He handed his weapon and badge to Sergeant Harris. "You are suspended from your duties, with immediate effect," Harris announced, leaving no room for discussion. The murmur from the crowd grew louder, timid applause, cries of satisfaction, and indignant whispers mingled. Jackson Miller had just realized, in all its brutality, that his impulsive act had sealed his career. Marcus Thompson, still calm, addressed Jackson in a measured but firm voice. "Discipline and the law are not tools for intimidation. You just learned that lesson the hard way." Jackson lowered his head. Every word the colonel said resonated in his conscience like an inescapable judgment. Passers-by, witnesses, and even Jackson's colleagues knew he had just crossed a line that could not be repaired. Sergeant Harris, seeing the scale of the disaster, ordered the witnesses to remain calm and not interfere. But the reality was already etched into the phones of dozens of people. The videos would circulate throughout the city, and the scandal would only just begin. Jackson Miller had just realized, too late, that his arrogance, hatred, and racism had ruined his career, honor, and reputation in a single minute. No sooner had the incident ended than videos captured by witnesses began circulating on social media. Within minutes, hundreds of people were watching, commenting on, and sharing the scene. The tension, already palpable at the scene, escalated into a viral scandal. The local media immediately picked up the story. "Police officer points his gun at a black Army colonel in Atlanta, he's in the thick of it," headlined online newspapers and television channels. Every shot of the video showed Jackson Miller, red with anger, holding his gun pointed at the calm and imposing Marcus Thompson. Comments poured in, indignation, anger, but also admiration for the colonel's composure and dignity. "He really thought he could intimidate a decorated veteran?" exclaimed a television presenter. "This is a disgrace for the local police," added a journalist. At the gas station, passers-by gathered in small groups, chatting animatedly. "I can't believe he did that. It's so arrogant and dangerous," murmured a shocked woman. "Watch the video," shouted a young man, showing his phone. "It's all over social media now." Jackson Miller, sitting in the patrol car with Sergeant Harris beside him, could hear notifications from his colleagues and friends. Hundreds of messages were coming in, some shocked, others ridiculing his situation. Each phone vibration seemed to drive the point of shame home a little more. "I never would have thought it would cause such a stir," Jackson murmured, his voice trembling, his jaw clenched. Harris stared at him coldly. "You thought your uniform protected you from everything? Look now. Everyone knows what you did. Your career is over, Miller. And believe me, people won't forget this." Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson, surrounded by witnesses and passers-by, remained calm and dignified. He agreed to interviews with the media, explaining simply, "Discipline and the law are there to protect, not to intimidate. This kind of abuse must not be tolerated, regardless of rank or uniform." The colonel's words echoed throughout the city. Newspapers and television stations repeated every sentence. Jackson Miller realized, helplessly, that the situation would never be the same again. His arrogance, his racism, and his impulsiveness had been captured, broadcast, and judged by thousands of people in a matter of hours. The notifications kept coming. Calls from superiors and colleagues poured in, some expressing disapproval, others simply shocked. Jackson realized that his career, which he had built over 10 years on authority and intimidation, had just crumbled in an instant. The public scandal was no longer a mere isolated incident, it was a total, irreversible, and public humiliation. And deep down, Jackson felt the first real wave of fear and shame in his life. A few weeks after the incident, Jackson Miller was summoned before the Atlanta Police Disciplinary Committee. The room was solemn, cold, and every detail seemed to underline the importance of the case. The large windows let in harsh light, the walls were covered with portraits of decorated police officers, and a long table stood in the center, behind which sat the members of the committee. Jackson entered, his face pale and his gait hesitant. Each step echoed on the parquet floor, accentuating his nervousness. Before him stood the chairman of the committee, the Captain. Richard Lawson gave her a piercing look. "Officer Miller, you are here to answer for your actions on the day of the incident involving Colonel Marcus Thompson. Please take your seat." Jackson sat down, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. Marcus sat calmly and imposingly in the room as the primary witness. Videos of the incident were projected onto a large screen behind the commission. Every movement, every expression of Jackson's was visible to everyone. Captain Lawson began. "Officer Miller, you pointed your weapon at a senior officer, a respected and decorated civilian, in public. Your actions constitute an abuse of power, racist behavior, and a serious endangerment of the life of another. What is your defense?" Jackson lowered his head. The words remained stuck in his throat. He had always believed he could manipulate or minimize his actions, but faced with the irrefutable evidence and the colonel's gaze, he could no longer justify anything. I admit I acted impulsively," he murmured, his voice trembling. I shouldn't have." The commission exchanged glances, silent but implacable. Witnesses were called, each describing the scene, Jackson's arrogance and Marcus Thompson's impressive composure. The video footage shown reinforced each testimony. After several hours of hearings, the committee retired to deliberate. The minutes seemed like hours for Jackson. Every sound in the room seemed to amplify his guilt. When they returned, Captain Lawson spoke. "Officer Jackson Miller, after a thorough review of the evidence and testimony, the board finds you guilty of abuse of power, racist conduct, and endangering the life of a superior officer. Your dismissal is effective immediately. You will not be reinstated." A heavy silence fell over the room. Jackson felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. His career, his years of work, his reputation, everything had crumbled in an instant. Marcus Thompson calmly stood up and declared, "The law and discipline are there to protect, not to intimidate. Let this serve as a lesson to all those who think they can abuse their authority." Jackson left the room, head bowed, while cameras and witnesses immortalized his every step. For the first time, he fully understood the extent of his fall. He had lost everything through his own arrogance and racism. No sooner had the disciplinary committee's decision been made public than the case went viral at lightning speed. Social media was flooded with videos, articles, and comments denouncing Jackson Miller's arrogance and racism. Every gesture, every word, every expression of anger captured that day was now circulating throughout the city and beyond. "It's incredible, he actually pointed his gun at a colonel," exclaimed one internet user on Twitter, sharing the video with thousands of followers. "And he thought he could get away with it?" exclaimed one commenter on Facebook. Within the police community, the reactions were just as strong. Some of Jackson's colleagues whispered among themselves, shocked and embarrassed. "How could he have done that? It's a disgrace for the entire department." Local and national media outlets made it their headline news. Newspapers ran headlines such as, "Police officer suspended for pointing his weapon at a colonel," and "Abuse of power and racism, the downfall of an officer in Atlanta." Local television stations interviewed legal and police ethics experts, analyzing Jackson's every move and emphasizing the seriousness of his actions. Meanwhile, Jackson Miller found himself isolated. His colleagues avoided all contact, his friends stopped answering his calls, and even his family seemed embarrassed by the publicity surrounding the affair. Every notification on his phone was a painful reminder of the public humiliation. I never would have believed it would take on such proportions," he murmured to himself, sitting alone in his apartment. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson continued to receive messages of support and thanks for his dignity and composure. Citizens saw him as an example of courage in the face of injustice, while Jackson was now a symbol of abuse of power and racism. "He has destroyed his career," concluded a journalist during a television news broadcast, "and he can never go back. His reputation is irreparably tarnished." In the solitude of his apartment, Jackson Miller realized his life had just been turned upside down. What had begun as a simple traffic stop had transformed into a complete public humiliation. Every moment of that day was now etched in the collective memory. He had lost not only his job, but also the respect of his peers, of society, and above all, his dignity. Jackson Miller's downfall was not only professional, it was moral, social, and psychological. He had just learned, the hard way, that arrogance, impulsiveness, and racism had an irreversible price. A few weeks after the incident, Jackson Miller was living in complete isolation. His name circulated in the media, associated with abuse of power and racism. Newspapers, television programs, and social media constantly recounted his confrontation with Colonel Marcus Thompson, each video and testimony further damaging his reputation. Jackson spent his days alone, reliving the events in his head, trying in vain to justify his actions. But each memory reminded him of the same truth: he had been blinded by his arrogance and racism, and it had cost him everything he had built. His pride, his career, and even the trust of his colleagues, everything had vanished in minutes. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson continued his life with calm and dignity. He was praised for his self-control and for handling the situation without violence, despite the imminent danger. He received messages of appreciation from citizens, fellow military personnel, and even civilians who saw him as a model of courage and discipline. One day, Jackson realized that the media had moved on to other topics, but his name remained a symbol of punished arrogance and exposed racism. The reality was harsh: his reputation would never be fully rebuilt. Alone in his apartment, he relived that fateful day: the gas station, the sound of sirens, the phones pointed at him, the colonel's calm demeanor, and the exact moment he had lowered his weapon, humiliated and powerless. Every detail hammered home a truth he couldn't escape: he had believed he wielded absolute power, but Marcus Thompson's moral authority and dignity had crushed him. He murmured to himself, his voice trembling, "I lost everything, because of myself alone." Jackson finally understood that the real lesson lay not only in losing his job, but in confronting his own arrogance and racism. Power does not reside in fear or violence, but in self-control, respect, and integrity, qualities he had sorely lacked. Jackson Miller's story became a public warning: even a police officer with a 10-year career can lose everything in an instant if he abuses his authority and lets hatred guide his actions. And Marcus Thompson, true to his dignity, remained a living example of courage, discipline, and respect, showing that true authority is not imposed by fear, but by integrity and self-control. Jackson Miller's downfall was complete, irreversible, and the lesson etched in everyone's memory: arrogance and racism, when they meet discipline and justice, leave no chance of easy redemption.